IVM.
Yuddha is for adults. It contains graphic depictions of violence against humans and animals. If you feel you'll be triggered by the accounts of violence in this podcast, it's best you skip through those bits. That said, on to the episode.
The Deccan, 1054. A cloud of red dust and screams spreads across the battlefield of Koppam on the banks of the Tungabhadra river. A king shades his eyes and tries to squint through the chaos. Behind him, his guards mutter and heft their long lacquered bows and check to make sure that they have enough arrows. Beneath him, an 8-foot-tall bull elephant flicks its ears impatiently, gathers some dust in its trunk and throws it in a plume over its painted sides. The great bell around its neck clangs. Soon, out of the cloud of dust, the king hears indistinct shouts and the clanging of more bells. He sees the looming silhouettes of more war elephants. He wipes the sweat from his brow and strokes his thick black beard. He grasps the howdah of his elephant and orders his mahout to move forward to join the friendly troops that he is sure have come to rescue him and return him to his army. And then he thinks he will get back to slaughtering his enemies at the front of a horde of war elephants, as he always does. Rajadhiraja Chola, the son and grandson of two of South India's most famous warlords, has no idea that only a few hours from now, his bleeding corpse will be immortalized as that of the king who died on an elephant. Welcome to Yuddha, the Indian Military History Podcast. My name is Anirudh
And I'm Aditya Ramanathan. To those of our listeners who don't know, Yuddha or Yuddha, depending on how you want to pronounce it, is an old Sanskrit word for war. Don't be confused if you hear Anirudh and I say this word in different ways. It only reflects the varied linguistic heritage of the subcontinent. Now in Yuddha, we are of course looking at the phenomenon of war in the Indian subcontinent. And when I say Indian subcontinent, I really mean a bunch of countries. There's the modern republic that we call India. That's where both of us are from. Then there's Pakistan and Bangladesh, Nepal and Bhutan in the high Himalayas. There's Sri Lanka and Maldives in the Indian Ocean. Now, fixed or precise boundaries are meaningless in the whole great ebb and flow of history. So that means that Afghanistan, which is really integral to the story of the subcontinent, is part of our star cast of countries along with India and Pakistan. And even Myanmar will make frequent guest appearances here.
And it's not just Myanmar either, right? We are going to be talking about places from as far away as even China and Indonesia. There has been almost no part of the world that has not seen armies from the subcontinent at some point or another. I think we mentioned in our introductory episode, for example, that we know that Indian mahouts fought in the wars that followed the death of Alexander, and we know for sure that Indian armies fought, or armies from the subcontinent to be more precise, fought in the world wars. So what this podcast is really about is this kind of 1,000-year survey of the last millennium of conflict in the subcontinent.
That's right. And throughout these episodes, it's not just looking at individual campaigns or battles, but it's also about looking at the connection between war and really the broader canvas of the subcontinent's past and present. So we're going to look back into the mists of time to 1,000 years back, and we're going to travel all the way to our time, to the 21st century. And as Anirudh's intro will have clearly indicated, what we're going to talk about today are war elephants. Back in ancient times, somebody decided to take the Asian elephant, the second largest land animal on earth after the African elephant, and turn it into, of all things, an instrument of combat, right?
And if you think about who was this crazy individual sitting in India in, the 7th or 8th century BCE, who looks at this enormous creature about 8 feet tall and that weighs about 4 or 5 tons and says, maybe it's a good idea for me to sit on it. And it becomes an icon really of the practice of warfare in the subcontinent, right? You hear about war elephants in Nepal, you hear about them in Sri Lanka, you hear about them in Bangladesh, you hear about them in Pakistan, and you do hear about war elephants being used in Southeast Asia as well. It's one of the most long-lasting military doctrines, if I can use that term, especially when it comes to the subcontinent. You hear about war elephants fighting Alexander in the 4th century BCE, and you hear about war elephants when you have Europeans visiting the Mughal courts and the courts of their successors more than 2,000 years later. But there's still so much that we don't know about these fascinating creatures. Even though we know they were present in India, we know very little about the kind of context in which they originated, the kind of context in which they were used. We don't know if they were really tanks of the medieval world as some people portray them. We don't know if they were just used as mobile archery platforms. So that's basically what we're going to be getting into in this episode. We're going to try and understand how were war elephants captured, why were war elephants so important to India, why was it that Indian states continued to persist with using war elephants over all these centuries, and of course the interesting details that you don't generally hear about Indian military history, stuff like what kind of armaments would you have seen on the medieval Indian battlefield, what kind of people would you have seen there, what would have brought these people to the battlefield. And we're going to use the Battle of Koppam, as you might have guessed, to kind of discuss a lot of these issues. So let me just kind of broadly give you a sense of what the structure of this podcast is going to be. Since we're going to be talking about war elephants and we're going to be talking about the Battle of Koppam, let's first try to understand what on earth a battle actually looks like in medieval India. We'll try to understand who are the people who are fighting on that fateful day at Koppam. And then we're actually going to get to the meat of the conversation, which is what exactly does a war elephant do on a battlefield?
Yeah, and to address your very first question, which is what did a battlefield look like 1,000 years back? Obviously, we don't know a lot of details, but some broad outlines we can tell for sure. One is that, once armies are camped close to each other, there would be a sort of tacit understanding that they would give battle, that they would fight in the fields nearby. By the way, there are no designated battlefields in real life. Yep. This would be people's farms, it would be meadows, it would be their homes. And speaking very broadly, the first stage would be the preliminaries. Troops on both sides would harass each other while they were foraging or patrolling, perhaps raiding each other's camps. And when finally both armies assembled on the day of the battle, skirmishers would continue the harassment, right? They would fling missiles at each other. They would try and inflict casualties, cause disruption.
So I'm just going to pause you right there to kind of break it down for me even further, right? So when you say foraging, patrolling, what do these mean? What is the necessity for an army to forage or patrol? What are skirmishers? Who are the guys who are skirmishing, as it were? What are the things that they're flinging?
Sure. Foraging, the most common reason you would forage is because you need feed for your animals. These would, of course, be war elephants, for example, but it would also be draft animals, beasts of burden that carry things, and that would include other elephants. So basically, to meet their basic dietary requirements, you'd need to go out and collect fodder. You'd also have to patrol a camp, or even when an army is on the move, you'd have scouts out in the front looking out for an enemy, looking out for a surprise. And it's frequently these scouts that often clash and are at the very first violent incident in what eventually turns out to be a battle. Now, when armies go out to meet each other, not everybody fights the same way. Some people are explicitly skirmishers. The typical technical term people use is light infantry, and it's a pretty useful way to describe what they do. These are people who are not necessarily closely packed. They are in loose formation. They typically carry missiles like javelins to throw at each other, or they might even carry bows, for example, and shoot. And so they're there to inflict casualties at a distance. Now, obviously, if I have skirmishers and my enemy doesn't, I have a big advantage over my enemy because I can harass my enemy's soldiers before they ever get to my main force, maybe even disrupt them. Now, in reality, of course, the enemy would probably have skirmishers of their own. And so what would end up happening is that our skirmishers would end up fighting.
So what you're saying is that once you get your army to some place where you're going to fight the enemy, you basically set up your camp there, you figure out how to get supplies for all your animals, and so on and so forth. And while you're doing that, your enemy is doing the same thing as well. So you're trying to disrupt their operations, they're trying to disrupt yours.
And you're also, so you're both disrupting your enemy's operations and trying to protect your own.
So this is all happening in the days leading up to the battle, as it were. So What happens once this activity actually begins?
Yeah, and as these armies would draw, of course, close to each other, like I said, the skirmishers would basically skirmish. They would do what they do. They would try and throw missiles at each other and perhaps try and gain some small advantage, protect their main body of troops. And eventually, your main body of troops, your infantry, your cavalry, whether horse or elephant, would clash head on. This would be with spears, this would be with axes,
Swords, maces, basically whatever you can get your hands on to inflict any kind of trauma on your enemy.
Exactly. And this wouldn't be like in the movies, right? You wouldn't have a melee. You wouldn't have everybody just piling on each other randomly. What would happen is something more like what you see, for example, in a riot or in a clash between police and protesters today. You have one side, you have two very distinct sides. You have one side, for instance, throwing stones, and you have another side using shields to protect themselves from those stones. That is perhaps the closest we'll get today to what it looked like when skirmishers were attacking a main body of troops. But now imagine you have cops on both sides. And those cops also have stones and are throwing stones at each other. Now, they're not going to get into a melee. It's not going to be each man for himself with no line in between. What they're going to do is they're going to stick together and they're going to try and gain an advantage over the other and drive the other one away. And the moment you can drive someone away, you can break their formation and pursue them, you've basically gained victory. And this was the broad dynamic of battle 1,000 years back and really through much of the pre-modern world.
I find that final point that you mentioned very interesting, right? Very often when I think about battles, because we tend to see them through Bollywood, there's a tendency to assume that battles should always end with a slaughter. And that slaughter happens as a result of one side being more powerful or braver than the other. But what you're describing to me is that's not really the case. Essentially, what a battle works out to in practice is breaking your enemy's cohesion, breaking their morale, getting them to run away. And it's in the process of them running away and exposing themselves to you, that's when you actually get most of the slaughtering done.
Yeah, that is the case in various periods and various places in history. But there are mitigating factors. Sometimes battles are so hard fought that it is really difficult for one side to pursue the other even after it's broken. There's also psychological reasons. If you don't necessarily have much personal animus towards the other people, if you speak similar languages, eat similar food, worship the same gods, your motivation to go and slaughter them is lower.
And all of these are things that are going to come up in great detail in all of our following episodes, I'm
Absolutely,
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we understood broadly what a battlefield might look like. Who are the people who are fighting at the Battle of Koppam in 1054? Now, we started by talking about Rajadiraja Chola. I'm sure that for a lot of our Indian listeners, the Cholas are going to be fairly familiar. They're one of the most famous of all South Indian kingdoms. And they're best known, of course, for their infamous invasions of Southeast Asia. But as you're going to see through this episode, we're doing a lot of pretty interesting stuff in India as well. So can you tell us a bit about who the Cholas are? How do they come to Koppam?
Sure. Now, you are, of course, the medieval Deccan nerd, so I'm going to leave most of this explanation to you, but I'm going to try talking about the Cholas. Okay. Now, Cholas, of course, the name of this old ruling dynasty that goes back more than 2 millennia. And, the guys who call themselves Cholas in medieval times, about 1,000 years back, were using the power of that name, using that brand, if you will, to establish their own power. And they were clearly so successful because even today when we say Cholas, what we mean are these guys from medieval times.
Yeah, it's not the first group of people to actually claim that name.
Yeah. And the key figures here, especially the most important figure here is Rajaraja Chola. And he's the guy who turned the Cholas into this major power and, into this big force of history in the subcontinent. And he's one of those guys who will basically make you believe in the great man theory of history. The idea that a single individual can have a profound impact on the course of history.
So how exactly did Rajaraja do that?
Well, so both Rajaraja and his son Rajendra were basically, I think, political and military geniuses. They had this quite amazing ability to both engage and co-opt the local Tamil elites. And they gave everybody a piece of the pie. They let everybody get their beak wet. And they used things like literature and culture to build their own legitimacy, to invoke the sense of Tamil identity. And to associate that Tamil identity with their own person, their own family. The Cholas even named districts of their kingdoms after themselves, and they integrated the districts into these mandalams. So, for instance, a chunk of the old Pallava country was called Jayangonda Chora Mandalam, or the Circle of the Victorious Chora. These were obviously very humble people.
Yeah, quite a lot like Indian politicians today.
Yeah. And this is just domestic politics. But both of these guys, both Raja Chora and Rajendra, also have this very deep understanding, very shrewd understanding of the geopolitics of the region. The changing dynamics of trade in both the Indian Ocean and on land in the Deccan. And they also understand the shifting power of rival kingdoms. And when they use military force, of course, they're absolutely brutal.
So I think the Chalukyas, who are the other side of the battlefield at Koppam, provide a very interesting. Simultaneously, they're quite similar to the Cholas in some ways, but also quite different in some ways. So I think we should probably kind of help our listeners get a sense of the geography that we're talking about, right? So I'm sure all of you are familiar with the big pointy tip of India that basically projects into the Indian Ocean.
The ice cream cone.
The ice cream cone. Now, the very bottom of the ice cream cone is where the Cholas are. The Cholas basically control very fertile agrarian territory that's watered by the Kaveri River Valley and a bunch of other rivers, some of them flowing from the Deccan, some of them flowing from the Western Ghats, which create this large kind of flat fertile plain, which is great for rice cultivation. So this was historically divided up among a number of different small kingdoms, and the Cholas that you just talked about, Aditya, these guys emerged by the early 11th century to basically dominate the southern tip of the subcontinent. Now, you mentioned the fact that these guys understand geopolitics, right? So here's a really great example. Rajaraja comes to the throne in the late 970s, and one of the very first things he does is attack this port on India's west coast. And it just turns out that a few years before that is when the Fatimid Caliphate had risen to power in Egypt. Roughly on the same time, the Sung dynasty had risen to power in China. So clearly, Rajaraja seems to have understood that, okay, in this decade, I'm seeing that on both sides of the subcontinent, there are these new commercial powerhouses emerging. And so if I want to ensure that I have control over this new trend, I have to go out and take out a rival's port. So this is one example of many remarkably inspired strategic choices that you see the Cholas constantly making. And I bring that up because of their great rivals, the Chalukyas, who really, really pushed them to innovate to be as brutal as they possibly could. And now the Chalukyas are a bit upriver from where the Cholas are. Now imagine that we're looking at the middle of the ice cream cone of the Indian peninsula, right? This is the rocky plateau that is called the Deccan. And that was formed millions of years ago when the Indian plate was basically passing over this patch of geological instability on the Earth's crust, which led to this huge sheet of volcanic lava just forming and slowly solidifying over centuries. And this area, which is pretty dry, not very fertile, is also watered by rivers. It's watered by the Krishna, the Tungabhadra, and the Godavari rivers, all of which have their own network of tributaries. And even though very often the soils that they pass through aren't very fertile, Deccan polities had this remarkable ability to kind of build irrigation systems and to nevertheless kind of maximize the fertile potential of their land. But they're also constantly at the disadvantage in terms of just sheer numbers, especially compared to the Chora country. So what you see in the Deccan are some fairly remarkable political innovations, and a lot of them are led by the dynasty called the Chalukyas. Now the Chalukyas are one of my pet topics, as Aditya briefly mentioned. I have a book about the Chalukyas coming out sometime in the middle of this year, which you guys can check out if you're interested. But the reason that we bring them up today is because the Chalukyas have this rivalry going on with the Cholas. Aditya mentioned how the Cholas basically engaged and co-opted local Tamil elites, right? Now the Chalukyas were the original masters of that game. Their imperial title is Shri Prithvi Vallabha. Now, to both Indian and non-Indian listeners, this is a Sanskrit compound word that means fortune's favorite and earth's beloved. So what the Chalukyas were doing by claiming this sort of imperial title was connecting themselves to the gods and using that kind of connection to divinity as a political tool. So you see the Chalukya overlord of the Deccan over the course of centuries using the title of Shri Prithvi Vallabha, which kind of gives it a sort of institutional resilience. So the Deccanese are fairly invested in the survival and the continuation of the Chalukya political formation. Now, when the Cholas appear on the scene in the late 10th, early 11th century, the Cholas are absolutely obsessed with proving that they are great martial, manly kings. And they do that in a lot of ways. As I mentioned, you have Rajaraja attacking ports and all that strategically. You see his son Rajendra Chola, who we're going to talk about him a lot more in the next episode. But Rajendra Chola is most famous for two things: his invasion of North India, which he sends this massive army up along the east coast, and his invasion of Southeast Asia. Both of which are like kind of extraordinary statements for an Indian imperial power to be making. And the reason why the Cholas are doing this is because it's so important for the king to be a celebrity, to be this kind of great martial overlord, which the Chalukyas aren't really necessarily. And basically, the Chola strategy to take out the Chalukyas was they understand these guys are powerful, they understand these guys aren't going to go away easily. So you have to break them psychologically. You have to break the entire Deccan's faith in the Chalukyas. Which, of course, brings us to Rajadhiraja Chola invading the Deccan in 1054. So, Aditya, who exactly was this guy, Rajadhiraja? How was it that he ended up in the Deccan in the year 1054?
Well, so there's something about these Cholas, right? All of them seem to be larger than life figures and pretty crazy to boot.
Just look at their names, man. Rajaraja means king of kings. Rajendra means lord of kings. Rajadhiraja is again king of kings. Like clearly, as you said, very, very modest family.
Yeah. Humility is a family trait. So Rajadhiraja is one of those guys who like ruthlessly consolidates his power. He has no problem lopping off the heads of his royal rivals. And it's really in 1048 that he begins his campaign into the Deccan to take care of these Chalukyas. And he actually burns down the Chalukya capital, Kalyana.
It's quite an interesting campaign by the standards of medieval India because of just how brutal Rajadhiraja is. Now, since I'm coming at this from the perspective of the Deccan, I've been reading about the Chalukyas. I might not sound like the biggest fan of the Cholas, which is a fairly accurate stance given the kind of things that these guys have got up to. But let me just give you an example. We know that when Rajadhiraja invaded the Deccan in 1048, he came across this city called Pundur. He systematically razed it to the ground, had its site plowed with ashes and sown with millet and salt. We also know that he captured the family of one of the leading Chalukya generals, mutilated them, subjected them to all kinds of humiliations. He made quite a habit of going to sacred sites along the Deccan's rivers and bathing his war elephants there. And all of these, of course, are part of this broader pattern, right?
So bathing war elephants there is a way of insulting your enemy.
Exactly. To take your war elephants to a religious site that is such and keep in mind, we're talking about medieval India here. Just like in medieval Europe, religious sites have enormous strategic significance because being in control, being a patron of a religious site gives you a lot of legitimacy, gives you a lot of political power. The fact that Rajadhiraja is going and systematically searching for the Deccan sacred sites and bathing his war elephants there is attempting to show to the people of the Deccan that, look, your emperor is not able to do for you the basic thing that an emperor is supposed to do. He's supposed to defend you, he's supposed to defend your farms, he's supposed to defend your cities, and he's supposed to be favored by the gods. But here I am with my war elephants, and I'm bathing them in the waters of the Deccan.
Actually, this seems like what a lot of insurgents and raiders have done throughout history, which is to reduce confidence in the incumbent rulers.
Unfortunately, Rajadhiraja kind of met his match when it comes to the person who's leading the Chalukyas in 1054, and this was the Emperor Someshvara I. Now, Someshvara means Lord of the Soma, Lord of the Moon, which is one of the titles of the god Shiva. And Someshvara is one of the most remarkable and unsung political geniuses of the Indian subcontinent, in my view. Aditya and I have this whole episode about him which we record for another podcast. We'll put a link to it in the description so you can check it out if you're interested. But Someshvara basically is a kind of man who knows how to inspire loyalty. We know of one family called the Varnasa dynasty. I don't know if dynasty is the right term, but they're basically a family of generals. They are Brahmins of the Vasishtha Gotra. And the patriarch of that family was a chap called Kalidasa, who seems to have saved Someshvara's father from a coup at some point. Now, by the time Someshvara comes to the throne, Kalidasa and all three of his brothers are Chalukya generals. Kalidasa alone has 5 sons, of whom at least 3 might have served as generals. And we're talking about campaigns ranging from as far as Madhya Pradesh to the Tamil country. This is an enormous kind of range that we're talking about. So clearly the Deccan has got its fingers in a lot of pies. And that kind of centrality of the Deccan, the fact that it's positioned in the middle of the ice cream cone of South India, is what gives Someshvara essentially his grand strategy to deal with the Cholas. Now, I talked about how the Cholas are going and trying to break Chalukya power in the Deccan. The Chalukya response is to kind of spread the Cholas out across as many fronts as they possibly can. So you keep seeing under Someshvara's reign, the Chalukyas are doing stuff in Andhra, for example, which is just north of the Tamil country along India's east coast. So you'd constantly see Chola forces being directed there. What happens in 1054 is that basically Someshvara has really pissed Rajadi Raja off to the point where Rajadi Raja can think of no solution other than bringing this massive Tamil army to the Deccan and settling matters with the Chalukyas once and for all. But unfortunately, the Chalukyas were expecting him to do exactly that.
So that would bring us to Battle of Koppam itself, right? So now when we talk about these two armies, the Cholas and the Chalukyas meeting there, we've talked about the broad outlines of what such campaigns would look like. But what would these armies specifically look like? How would they march? What would the soldiers look like? How would they be armed? How would they be dressed? And what would those war elephants look like?
So we actually have literature from the period that tells us a fair bit about this. So even though they're obviously focusing on the elite regiments of the army, they're still fairly vivid descriptions. So these are from a text called the Yashastilaka, which is a Jain text written in the 9th century in Karnataka. So not too far away in time and place from the situation we're talking about. Now, the Deccani soldiers, we are told, had wavy black hair. It was fastened with a vibrant cloth band around their forehead, and their chests were left bare and draped in triple necklaces made of very, very colorful beads. They would have had thick iron bracelets on their forearms all the way up to the elbows. Their legs were covered in loincloths. These were tucked around their knees. And they would have had a band around their waist in which they had a dagger tucked in. And they would have had weapons of their choice, which could be anything from a club to a sword, in their hands. Now, interestingly enough, and I think this is a point that really cannot be emphasized sufficiently, medieval South Indian swords were straight. They were not those weird curvy scimitar things that you see in movies,
which are very much of Central Asian origin.
Central Asian origin. And while they might be accurate enough for a Deccan or a South Indian king after maybe the 1700s, if you're looking at a statue of a Chola king, or if you're looking at a statue of a Deccan king from before the time that the Muslim kingdoms had come to South India, then you would only see these beautiful leaf-shaped blades, sometimes very thick, heavy broadswords that are meant for cleaving, very evidently.
Yeah, they're meant to bludgeon.
Exactly, bludgeoning. So they seem almost like very large butcher's knives. And that's just a pet peeve of mine that I thought had to be brought up at all costs. So Deccani swords, nothing like what you see in modern sculptures at all. Now, as for the Cholas themselves, equally vivid, according to the Yashastilaka, which is fairly poetic in its description. These guys look like the dark waves of the Yamuna blended with the filaments of lotus blossoms. Clearly, these are Indians who look like Indians do today. They would have had gold rings swinging from their ears, so their earlobes would actually have been extended by the weight of those earrings. Their bodies were painted with turmeric, and you can imagine as the day wore on, it would be splattered with blood, and that solution would have kind of dripped down with sweat. So very vivid sort of coloring. And they would have held shields, usually made of leather, sometimes of wicker, covered in blood red lead.
That's a really vivid description of these soldiers, and it's not the sort that you see anywhere, like you said, in Bollywood or in comics or anything like that. But what would those war elephants look like? Because again, I always see these terrible anachronisms in depictions of these guys. Again, people make Choras look like Mughals.
Yeah, that's the most ridiculous thing, right? It's strange how visually, Indians seem to think that all Indian armies look like Mughal armies. It would be like modern European artists saying that, yeah, you know what, all of our armies always look like French armies and we always had these many knights and everything. That's ridiculous. Indian armies very drastically in composition based on the wealth of the state that was raising them. And of course, war elephants also varied accordingly. Now, a very general sort of description, we know that war elephants tended to have this kind of caparison, so it would have a very large kind of square cloth that was draped over their back, upon which you would usually have a tower of some sort, so usually made of leather or wood, and that would give you a kind of stable platform for archers to stand on, for javelin men to stand on. The war elephant itself would have been fairly frightfully decorated, so very, very bright patterns all over its head. You would have seen it wearing a bell around its neck, so as it charges, it gives you this terrifying sound, as if the bells of death are ringing for you, as it were. Some of them even had swords tied to their tusks. In their trunks, you'd see them carrying stuff like maces or swords, or even chains just attached to the trunk. So as it's waving around, it hits as many people as it possibly can. And then again, you have the people who are sitting on the elephant, who themselves tend to be rich enough to afford a war elephant, which is not a lot of people in India. And you would have seen these people with these beautifully lacquered bows, which would have been covered in gold leaf, stripes of gold leaf. And they would have been trained to kind of shoot so rapidly that the second they lose an arrow, they have another one notched and ready to lose. So these are highly, highly trained individuals who are riding the elephant. They've clearly put a lot of money into equipping the elephant. And this, of course, brings us to the broader question of how exactly these elephants would have been used in combat, because we have descriptions of how they looked, we have descriptions of how the people who rode them looked, but there's a lot of controversy, which we're going to get into right now, as to how useful they actually were in combat. So can you tell us a bit about what the objections are to the question of a war elephant just charging into battle and wrecking stuff?
Sure. I'll just step back for a minute and just look back at the Battle of Koppam, right? So this is a battle that's kind of shrouded in mystery. We don't really know a lot about the details of what happened. But let's just indulge our imagination for a second and imagine you go back in time to the aftermath of the battle, and you look at the terrible carnage of this battlefield, and it's really, you can think of it as a large crime scene. And imagine yourself as the forensic investigator trying to figure out what happened. You would have, for instance, where the infantry clashed, knots of corpses, dead and dying people. And you would have, in places where there was pursuit, again, a smaller litter of people who were unfortunately cut down.
You'll probably see, so you see wounds in their back, you'll probably see hoof prints, maybe elephant paw marks.
Exactly. Maybe someone unfortunately crushed by an elephant. But what I'm not sure about is what that elephant combat would look like. I'm assuming there would be dead elephants on that ground, quite brutally ripped apart. But how many would be there at one place? How would these elephants fight? So there's two distinct types of combat we're talking about here. One is elephant cavalry fighting each other, and the other is elephant cavalry fighting infantry, foot soldiers. Let's think for a second about how elephant cavalry might have fought each other by simply trying to understand how shock horse cavalry have fought each other historically. Now, obviously, when two bodies of horse charge at each other, if everybody is tightly grouped and they charge right at each other, they're going to collide and there's going to be disaster. But we know from historical anecdotes, from examples, that's not what happens. What instead happens is actually a sort of tacit cooperation. As bodies of shock horsemen armed with lances, armed with swords, charge at each other, they actually open up and create lanes in which they can charge into each other's body. And this is actually closer to the melee that we're talking about. And there people take their chances. They try and knock each other off horses, they try and slash and stab at each other. And then the two bodies of cavalry then reorganize again and get ready for a second clash. And I wonder if something similar did not happen with elephant cavalry. What I'm not sure about is what happened when elephants were fighting infantry. Now, by themselves, while a charge of elephants is terrifying, psychologically. Remember, the people fighting them on the ground were also used to the sight of elephants. They'd heard those elephant bells ring. And these guys are very different from us. Let's be clear. They're much more used to combat, to bloodshed than any of us. And so I'm assuming psychologically it would not be as shocking for them as it might be for us, which means that the elephant cavalry would have to do something more than merely charge. One obvious measure they can take is to use infantry of their own. Maybe use skirmishers, for example, to screen their elephant cavalry.
I think this is a good point to talk about the archetypal example of infantry fighting elephants, right? I personally have found that whenever I tweet about how amazing war elephants are, somebody or the other feels compelled to inform me that no, but if you look at the Romans dealt with them so easily, and this proves that war elephants actually sucked. So can you tell us a little bit about how war elephants were dealt with by Romans?
Sure. And the most commonly cited example of this is the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, when the Roman general Scipio defeated the Carthaginian general Hannibal. What happened there clearly was that Hannibal probably had a few too many elephants, and they were probably not all that well trained. So at one point, when startled at the war cries, some elephants apparently charged prematurely. And then later, when the rest of the elephants charged the Roman infantry simply created lanes within their own ranks and let the elephants go through. And troops at the back could basically then dispatch those elephants at their own leisure. Couple of things here. One, these elephants were obviously not as well trained as, say, the elephants at Koppam. Two, these were probably not Asian elephants. They were probably the so-called African bush elephant, which is now extinct. It was a tiny species or subspecies of elephant that was found in North Africa. So again, this is, while this example is typically cited, it's not really comparable to, say, the medieval Deccan.
Yeah, so I mean, we have descriptions of how elephants were captured in the medieval Deccan. We have descriptions of how these creatures were trained. And I think a lot of the objections that the Romans come up to against war elephants is the idea that they're easily frightened, the idea that all you require is trained infantry to dispatch them, are kind of put to the test in the medieval Indian context. Because from what I can tell, it's not like Indians lacked for the ability to snipe elephants. It's not like Indians lacked for good archers. It's not like Indians lacked for disciplined infantry. What elephants did have, though, are this fairly extraordinary setup that was designed to capture elephants and to turn them into machines that could kill on battlefields. So the way that Indians did this was that you would actually have somebody called a superintendent for elephants who was attached to the royal court. His duty would be to organize elephant hunts and to also ensure the care of the royal elephants that belong to the king. And an elephant hunt would basically involve you digging this massive pit. Okay. At the center of the pit, you would put a bunch of tame female elephants, and you'd have a bridge connecting the center of that to the outside. Male elephants would, of course, be tempted by the scent of the females, come into the enclosure, then you'd remove the kind of drawbridge over the pit. So the male elephants are now stuck inside. Then you get your tame elephants outside. You starve the males for a few days until they're good and weak. And then you bring in more tame war elephants, beat the crap out of them, and capture them. And once you've captured them, you starve them a little further until they're more amenable to listening to orders. You basically cut a slit in the flesh of their neck and you tie a rope onto that area. So when you tug it, the elephant very acutely feels that pain. So you basically first use that to teach the elephant to follow where it's commanded. You tie the rope to a massive pole that's like sunk deep into the earth so the elephant can't pull it out. And you whack the elephant. You beat the crap out of it with whatever's on hand. You beat drums, instruments, you blow trumpets. You're essentially systematically inuring the beast to any sort of loud noises. We even have instances that we know of in Sri Lanka, up to very recently, I think the 16th century, where animals would be slaughtered in front of war elephants. And you'd have the blood sprayed all over the war elephant to give it a sense of the violence that it was expected to commit in battle. We have references to training dummies. So elephants would have been taught how to trample. They would have been taught what part of the man to pick up, what part to cut. these creatures were trained. They were taught to respond to commands. They were taught to move in undulating formations. They were taught to move in line. They were taught to respond to all kinds of fairly complicated commands. Even jumping, for example, is something that war elephants are supposed to have been trained in. And we have descriptions of the kind of diets that they would have had. So I'm actually going to read a bit from the Arthashastra, which is one of the most iconic texts of Indian statecraft. So it describes how the best elephant is about 40 years old, measures 7 cubits high, and is 9 cubits long with a girth of 10 cubits. It mentions different grades of elephants. And according to the grade of elephant, you get different kinds of rations. So the rations include 1 drona of rice kernels, half an adhaka of oil, 3 prashthas of ghee, 10 palas of salt, 50 palas of meat, 1 adhaka of juice, or twice that amount of curd, 1 adhaka of liquor, or double that amount of milk, along with 10 palas of sugar as a stimulating drink. And these are clearly animals that would have feasted.
Yeah, this is not the normal diet you would get in the wild.
This is not what an elephant normally eats. So we're talking about like alcohol, we're talking about meat, where essentially you can see that Indians know that their job is to feed the elephant to make it into a killing machine. In fact, he explicitly describes how do you know when an elephant is ready for battle. And he says, you know when it appears as follows. There is an emergence of redness. It is covered. Its sides are smooth. Its girth is even. Its flesh is evenly distributed with even back muscles. And it has a trough formed where its mahout can sit. So this is veterinary science. These are guys who have actually observed how elephants operate, what a healthy elephant looks like. They've figured out the kind of diet that elephants need to feed, and then they're using them for very particular sorts of applications. So Kautilya mentions now 4 types of elephants: the trainee elephant, which I just described, the war elephant, which we talked about earlier, the riding elephant, and the vicious elephant. So the riding elephant, usually females, much prettier, much more even tone, much more even gait. The vicious elephant is usually a male tusker that's in must. So it's in heat. It wants to reproduce. So it's absolutely loaded with testosterone, all kinds of hormones, and it becomes very, very violent. And we know from the Arthashastra that when these elephants were deployed in a formation, you would have war elephants in the front and the center. You would have these vicious elephants on the flanks to just like make sure that nobody got too close, and then riding elephants for the pleasure of the lords behind. So you'd probably have like lords who owned like 2 or 3 elephants who would bring them all to the battlefield, and which elephant was actually taken into battle depended on which elephant had the most illustrious career. We have descriptions of elephants who had renowned names because records were kept of the battles where they had fought and the number of rivals they had killed. And we even have descriptions of the fastenings and equipment from Kautilya himself. He says, the fastenings consist of a tying post, a neck chain, a girth, stirrup ropes, foot chain, upper chain, and so on. The equipment consists of a gourd, a bamboo, a mechanical device, and so on. The ornaments consist of Vaijayanti garland, Kshurapra necklace, covering, blanket, and the like. And the military ornaments consist of armor, lance, quiver, mechanical device, and the like. And he talks about a retinue of attendants: a veterinarian, a trainer, a mahout, a groom, guard, decorator, cook, feeder, foot restrainer, stall guard, sleep attendant, and so on and so forth. Each of which get like their own rations, they get their own salaries and so on. So it's a very complicated system.
Yeah, the logistics footprint is enormous for a single elephant. So given the amazing effort that is being put into capturing these elephants, breaking these wild animals and taming them, and then training them, feeding them, raising elephants for different purposes, you wouldn't do all of this if there wasn't some material benefit, right? So one material benefit is obviously that these elephants were seen as being effective on the battlefield. But there was also the issue of political and religious authority. Am I correct?
So, I mean, there's plenty of descriptions. Again, literature is a surprisingly useful source when it comes to medieval India. It's a shame that it's not sufficiently explored in the popular consciousness. But here's a bunch of quotes on authors talking about elephants. Where there are elephants, there is victory. The kingdoms of kings depend on elephants. One elephant, duly equipped and trained in the methods of war, is capable of slaying 6,000 well-caparisoned horses. This final sentence is something that I think is really worth getting into. An army without elephants is as despicable as a forest without a lion or a kingdom without a king. Now, keep in mind that in medieval India, the king is integral to your the sociological construct of what a state should be. In the medieval Indian worldview, the duty of the king is to essentially impose order upon chaos. The king is there to ensure that the castes all perform their particular duties. He's there to ensure that religious rituals are performed correctly for the gods. He's there to ensure that his people are protected from the enemies and that his court functions properly. He's here to ensure that poetry and art, all the things that are associated with kingship, are being properly produced. Now, to say that an army without elephants is like a kingdom without a king says something very, very extraordinary about how important elephants were seen as being, not just to the practice of kingship, because army is one of the components of the Indian state, but also at a more metaphysical level, how elephants are seen as integral to the business of ordering the world itself. It's a fairly complicated place for an animal to be in. And this has been one of the reasons why people have objected to Indian elephants, saying that, oh yeah, clearly Indians are worshipping elephants and that's why they're putting them on the battlefield. But I think that at least my stance on the matter is that if you look at the amount of resources that are being dedicated, if you look at the kind of functions that Kautilya mentions elephants being put to, he's talking about them being used to clear roads, he's talking about them being used to disperse the enemy, to cause a rout, to trample foot soldiers, and so on and so forth. Clearly, these are beasts that are militarily and politically useful in more ways than one.
Yeah, you do bring up some good points about how the Indian elephant was really different and much more capable than some imagine. But I think we've been giving the Indian elephant or the Asian elephant an easy time so far. Yes, those elephants at Zama may not have been up to the mark, but let's consider a few instances in which the Asian elephant has failed spectacularly.
Okay.
You jump about a couple of centuries after Koppam to 1277 and the Mongol invasion of Myanmar. You have a incident in which the king of Mian and his elephant cavalry army charge at a group of Mongol horsemen. And what these guys do is go into a patch of woods, tie up their horses, and then rain arrows on the elephant cavalry. And the elephant cavalry turns back, it routs, and then the Mongols pursue them into woods. And there's basically a huge massacre in the woods as men are knocked off their howdahs by branches of trees and are basically slaughtered by the pursuing Mongols.
So, I mean, this doesn't necessarily seem like a situation where one would want to use war elephants, right? You are pursuing an enemy into territory where your elephants aren't going to be as mobile as they normally are. You are advancing without your infantry escort. My inclination would be to say that rather than disproving the effectiveness of elephant cavalry, I think this is a great example of how not to use elephants. And I would say kudos to the Mongols for being able to kind of draw that king out and being able to take advantage of that structural weakness, where you know what the elephant's single weakness is and you're able to exploit it on the battlefield. I don't think the Mongols get enough credit. I mean, at least when it comes to discourse of Indian military history, I don't think the Mongolian style of doing warfare is sufficiently appreciated. We're going to get into the next episode, but that's all I'll say about it for now.
Yeah, I agree. The Mongols are extremely adaptable, right? And they did seem to spot the exact weakness in their opponent's army in this particular case. But let's move on to another example that's frequently cited. 1398. The Delhi Sultanate is a shadow of what it was before. And it's exactly the time that the great armies of Tamerlane or Timur enter India and march towards Delhi. And it's at the Battle of Delhi, the site that you can actually go and visit if you want, even today, that you had the Sultanate's elephants charging at Tamerlane's army. And what Tamerlane's army does in response is to gather up these camels, tie straw to their backs, light fires to those straws, and send those camels running towards the elephants. And the elephants rout again and go and plow back into their own army.
Okay, so again, this seems like one of those cases of, oh, look how big and stupid elephants are, and look how simple it is to fool these stupid creatures, which again doesn't seem to correspond to the descriptions and depictions we have of war elephants. Like I've mentioned that war elephants were, for example, trained to be immune to loud noises, trained to be immune to blood. I don't see why a trained corps of war elephants with equally trained and skilled mahouts would not have been able to see off that threat. But that said, I think in 1398 there was a lot of other things happening that enabled Timur to do what he did. We have to keep in mind that in 1398 the Delhi Sultanate was more or less on its last legs in a lot of ways. It had been increasingly provincialized. The army was a shadow of what it had been. And in fact, the elephant stables attached to the Sultan, which at one point were among the most feared military forces in the subcontinent, were a mere shadow of their former self. We have very little reliable knowledge of what was the quality of the elephants in the stable that day.
I agree. In fact, this is one of those speculative points, but I think very valid points we make about the Delhi Sultanate in 1398. I don't think they had the pick of the crop, basically,
exactly,
at that time. And secondly, yes, you pointed out where's the infantry, but also where's the screening horse cavalry? That would help drive away those camels, for example.
I mean, you would see them coming at you from quite a distance away. You would expect that you should be able to deploy some troops in response.
Or take some evasive action. So this doesn't seem to be an army where command and control seems to be working very well. The third objection, we go back in time, way back in time.
To where Echo's episode 1 starts.
Yeah, so we go back to the Battle of Hydaspes in the Indus Valley. Alexander's armies were invading India, and they fought Porus or Poru, however you want to say his name. And again, that's an example that people cite for where an army with elephants was defeated.
Well, that's an absolutely fascinating battle for a lot of reasons. So, I mean, I would recommend to any listeners who want to kind of get a little more detailed sense of what this battle might have been, to listen to an episode that I recorded a while back. Search for my podcast, Echoes of India. The very first episode starts with Alexander's invasion. But I think on that particular day, there's a lot of things that went on that led to Porus's defeat, and I don't think that they can necessarily be tied to war elephants. I think that just generally this guy's up against Alexander. Alexander has absolutely manipulated him to give battle on that particular day. Alexander tricked him, outmaneuvered him, but his army still fights on. And from what we can tell, Porus's army doesn't seem to have had very good infantry. And keep in mind that these guys are up against the Macedonians, easily the world's most formidable infantry force at that time, where you literally have armies that are drilled and trained for years to fight in formations with these 20-foot long pikes. There's very little that a small provincial kingdom, which has mostly light infantry, organized along tribal lines, can do against that. But the Indian infantry still seem to do okay. It seems to me that the infantry were what really decided the day during the Battle of the Hydaspes. If the Indians had better infantry, they might have put up a better fight. And as for how Porus used elephants that day, what we have, I think, actually supports the idea that war elephants are much more versatile than you'd expect on a battlefield. Keep in mind, this is an enemy that Indians had no experience fighting. They have never seen a Macedonian army. They don't know how the buggers fight. To give our listeners a little bit of context, they fought using phalanxes that consisted of 256 men, usually organized in like a deep rectangle or square formation. Each of them would have had long pikes called sarissas, which could be up to
23 feet.
23 feet. And they're organized so that the first 3 rows have all the spears pointing outwards. The rows behind them have spears at 45 degrees, and the rows behind them have spears held up vertically. You imagine a formation like that's masterfully drilled coming against you. Any army would flee, but that's not what the Indians do. In fact, they almost immediately seem to figure out how they can use war elephants against it. They charge them into the flanks of the pike formations. Keep in mind, 256 men in a formation can't really move around very quickly without destroying the formation. So the Indians understand that they're able to use war elephants against them. They understand that these pikes, the 20-foot-long sarissas, are crucial to the attacking power of the formation. So they actually drive elephants at right angles to the formation, so they're able to break the pikes. I don't think that any of these battles have really established their issues with the war elephant per se.
Yeah, I think what's really fascinating to me about Hidaspace is that elephants do seem to be used properly in that battle. They're accompanied by infantry. They're used to attack on the flanks. But I think, like you said, what really decided the day was the Macedonian heavy infantry. It's clear that one of the things that Poru's army lacked was similar infantry. And the real question to me there is, if both sides had roughly similar infantry, would you rather be on the side with the war elephants or the side without the war elephants? And to me, it's pretty clear.
Same for me as well, man.
Now, of course, what that Macedonian heavy infantry brings up is the idea of having an asymmetric capability, meaning if you have capability X, I have two options. I can either create a capability Y that can overcome your capability X. In this case, I can use Macedonian heavy infantry to impale your war elephants. The other option that I have is, of course, I also develop war elephants. And this brings us to the idea of developing symmetric capabilities, which is, I think, going to be a consistent theme throughout this podcast. What that means very simply is, if I don't have a magic weapon against your war elephants, and if your war elephants are even just moderately effective, it makes a great deal of sense for me to develop war elephants of my own. Because if I don't have war elephants, it means you can use your war elephants against my infantry, against my cavalry, against others. Whereas if I have war elephants of my own, you're forced to engage with them.
Yeah.
So that seems to me a very obvious military rationale for the idea of war elephants spreading throughout the subcontinent, parts of West Asia, mainland Southeast Asia.
It's like the gun, basically, right? It's analogous to almost any sort of military innovation that you care to think of. When you have a European state that's figured out how to use gunpowder, every other state now has to figure out how to use gunpowder or risk annihilation. Similarly, once Magadha had figured out war elephants, every Indian state had to figure out how to use war elephants or risk being annihilated.
That's exactly right. And we look at the example of the Mongols in Myanmar. It's very strange to have those elephants go unaccompanied by infantry. This brings us to another theme that's going to run throughout our podcast, which is the idea of combined arms warfare. One of the things that you want to do when you build your military capabilities is to create complex problems for your enemy. If you create just one problem, say a war elephant, it's easier for an enemy to find an antidote to it. But if you combine the war elephant with infantry, it creates a much more complicated problem. So you don't just have people on the elephant shooting at you, but you also have other light infantry skirmishing, protecting those elephants from the enemy's missiles. And you look at how fast an elephant typically moves. Tests have shown anywhere between 16 kilometers to 24 kilometers an hour at top speed. Usually an elephant isn't moving that fast. So it's not as hard for people on foot to keep up with the elephant and provide it some degree of protection and create new threats for the enemy. And that was clearly lacking in the case in Myanmar. Not to mention the completely unforgiving terrain, having elephants near wooded areas.
You have to think about stuff like basic military incompetence, right? When it comes to the interaction of Indian militaries with foreign militaries, there's often a tendency to blame the failure of Indian armies on systematic or structural factors of the way the Indian militaries worked, rather than on the incompetence of individual commanders. Because if you look at the overall trajectory of India's military history, the most fascinating thing to me is that the systems don't go away. While you will have invaders coming in, taking advantage of incompetence or some other mess up to win a battle, and of course the people who are responsible for the mistake will pay with it for their lives, the system itself, which is usually excoriated in like early texts written by the invaders, is almost invariably adapted by them. And I think that in itself is a testament to how militarily useful some of these systems are, including, of course, the war elephant.
Absolutely. If you look at the two asymmetric capabilities that I think were most effective against war elephants, which are basically the heavy infantry and the horse archers, even people who fielded those type of capabilities, when they came to India, developed war elephants because it was a very useful symmetric capability to field against other Indian armies.
Exactly.
Yeah, so this brings us to what happens when you have two fairly similar armies with fairly symmetric capabilities. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. The Cholas and Chalukyas are actually quite similar in many ways, right?
Yeah.
So what happens when their fairly similar armies clash?
So we have some interesting descriptions actually commissioned by the Chalukyas, which describe a Chalukya crown prince charging into battle at the head of this whole group of elephants. And it's quite explicitly mentioned that the other elephants followed his elephant like the thread follows the needle. So this, I think, is an indication that in some cases you would have princes, usually young men who are out there to kind of prove their military credentials, who would volunteer to be a part of a strike corps. Which I'm assuming, since they tend to be noblemen, would only be dispatched to a really weak spot in the enemy lines where they knew they could get some good kills, or where it was necessary to kind of break the enemy's morale and trigger a rout. So these would have been saved for really when they were actually needed. On the off chance that you actually had elephants to fight off a strike corps like this, I'm assuming that you would have seen something similar to what you see in Southeast Asia. Now, again, the issue is that because war elephants were purchased, paid for by a wide variety of social classes, were used for a wide variety of military roles, I need to clarify that I'm talking specifically about the aristocratic use of elephants. And this is surprisingly similar to the way that European medieval nobility used horses. So you would actually have essentially these great duels between rivals who are sitting on elephants. You just have like the mahout and maybe one squire sort of individual, and then the warlord himself sitting directly on the elephant's back. Sometimes you might have the warlord himself controlling the elephant, with his squire passing to him javelins and so on and so forth to throw at the enemy. But I assume that what would happen when you had two of these strike corps kind of colliding is something similar to what you described when you talked about shock cavalry, where you'd see kind of lanes opening up, and you would see men trying to get each other off their elephants using these long elephant lances. And we have descriptions of what these elephant lances looked like. You had a 21-finger long blade, so it's almost a couple of feet long. And it probably would have been wickedly sort of serrated or given this kind of sinuous shape, which is something that you see in a lot of Indian art. So a very, very long blade. Behind that would have been a little hook and also two spikes pointing backwards. So the idea was that you could use this on an enemy, or more ideally on his elephant. You would have a 9-foot-long staff that you would use to kind of drive the spearhead into any patch of exposed skin, like into a trunk, into an eye cavity, into genitalia, into any sort of exposed flesh. So it stabs inside easily, and then as you yank it out, it would absolutely lacerate the flesh and cause a lot of blood loss, whether it was a human or an elephant that you were attacking. And incidentally, courtly manuals of courtly protocol, which were written roughly around this time, such as the Manasollasa, which was written in the medieval Deccan, explicitly recommends to the man of means and sophistication that he should go out and seek out his enemy once he's on the battlefield and challenge him to a duel. So these guys were...
Sorry, this is very similar to European knightly chivalry.
It's extraordinary how similar it is. And... You have mentions of like warriors declaring themselves to their enemies, descriptions of how they kind of found them using their banner and so on and so forth. So these are all things that you're trained in. You're trained in recognizing who your rivals are. You're participating within you're participating in a strategic and tactical game where your army is trying to win the battle, but it's also a game of individual wills, where a lot of prestige was riding on the outcomes of these duels. So a lot of money was invested into making sure that your elephant was the best ride it could possibly be. Make sure it had the best training, the best equipment. Your mahout was secured at great expense. Guy had an absolutely great life. He would have been given a mansion and so on and so forth. You'd have generations of mahouts serving royal families and kings. Of course, we have to keep in mind that these are warlords. They are trained from their birth almost to fight, to lead on the battlefield. And these basically are the kind of people that Rajadhiraja would have had around him on that day in 1054, and also the kind of people that the Chalukyas sent hunting for him on that day in 1054.
And that's probably how Rajadhiraja met his end, right? In one of those duels between aristocrats on elephants. Yeah, I mean, just going back, if you think about it, it seems absurd to me that if you have these well-trained animals that weigh 4 to 5 tons in the case of a bull elephant, charging around in a battlefield, it doesn't influence the outcomes, because obviously it does. And I don't think we came to this podcast to either excessively praise the war elephant or to bury it, but hopefully to rightly assess it.
I think we should actually go a little further back and talk about why exactly the Chalukyas was so interested in killing Rajadhiraja on that fine day in 1054. I've talked about what Rajadhiraja's strategy was going into the Deccan. We mentioned how he burned the Chalukya capital, Kalyana. What we haven't mentioned is that Rajadhiraja actually crowned himself in the ashes of Kalyana, and he claimed the title of Vijaya Rajendra, which means the victorious Lord of Kings. All of these are matters of great humiliation for the Chalukyas, and while up to this point the Chalukyas were satisfied enough to let the soldiery, the masses, do the bulk of the fighting, while they generally kept their generals and their elite elephant duelists out of combat, it seems that at the Battle of Koppam, they had not one but 2 senior generals whose primary duty there was just to find and kill Rajadhiraja. We actually know what these generals' names were. One of them was the General Mararasa, the other was the General Bachi Raja. Now, Bachi Raja was the son of that Kalidasa Varnasa, that general that I mentioned earlier. So clearly, Someshvara Chalukya, the king, has chosen one of his proteges, somebody who is the son of a very close general of his, in order to do this symbolically important task. Now, how might this actually have happened? That's something that we just don't know. Was it standard practice for kings to put themselves in danger? We know it seems fairly obvious that kings tended to be close-ish to the front lines, but we don't have a lot of instances of kings actually dying on the battlefield. For Rajadhiraja to have died, I think indicates that either he was extremely confident, he was sure that no Chalukya could take him down, or that he was just simply lost and the Chalukyas managed to come across him without his escort through sheer dumb good luck, showered him with arrows perhaps, maybe they got elephants to beat the crap out of his elephant, surround it, make sure it couldn't escape, stabbed it brutally until the thing just collapsed out of blood loss. It seems likely that they would have offered him the option to surrender, but Rajadhiraja obviously refused, and he was beheaded and his head was taken to the Chalukya capital. On that day itself, on the battlefield, we are told that there was a rout. We are told that the Cholas began to flee from the battlefield until Rajadhiraja's brother, Rajendra II, rallied the forces, drove off the Chalukyas, and then crowned himself on the battlefield the next morning. Now, both sides, of course, claim victory. The Chalukyas, of course, as you can imagine, since they've killed this vicious enemy of theirs, they were really, really excited about it. We actually have an inscription that was commissioned to celebrate this, which says, "The wicked Chora, that deadly sinner, failing in his royal duty, abandoning the ancient dharma of his family, invaded and burned down a multitude of temples. His guilt bore an immediate harvest in his hand, and he gave his live head to Trilokya Malla Someshvara." So what we're seeing here is propaganda. The Chalukyas are spinning their loss of this battlefield, but their tactical victory in killing the Chora king as this huge game changer, which is not, because there is still a Chora king. The wars between the Cholas and Chalukyas have not stopped. All that's happening is that kings aren't dying anymore, but the common soldiers still are.
Yeah, there's so many things to unpack here. So firstly, with the outcome, it's what seems to have happened is that while Rajadhiraja died, maybe the Cholas took the field, but at the same time, this was not a decisive victory by any stretch of imagination. What's also really interesting is you brought up this idea of the king putting himself in danger. And that is actually a way in which to command and to motivate your own people. When the king is in danger, others are motivated not just by the example of the king, but also wanting to protect the king. And this, on the other hand, has to be weighed against the importance of command, of giving orders. And if a king is in the heat of battle and there are clouds of dust all around him and he can't see his own army, he is unable to give effective orders, for example. So I'm not sure how the Chalukya or the Chola kings and generals balance these competing aims. The other thing that really strikes me is that a rout was averted. You see throughout not just Indian history, but really pre-modern history all over the world, these fairly brutal armies in which one person, the head of the army, dies, a king dies, a general dies, and armies immediately rout and are just broken. That didn't happen. And that to me says something about how deeply entrenched and powerful these two polities were, both of them really. Now, of course, the sources give credit to Rajendra II. He's the man who stopped the rout and took the field again and so on.
And avenged his brothers for his brother's bleeding body.
Absolutely. All that. And I'm sure that he did something there. But what these sort of accounts seem to take away from is that they seem to imagine these warriors on the ground as some sort of automatons. And I really wonder if in polities like those of the Chalukyas and the Cholas, it was so easy to break these armies. I don't think it was.
I think that this is of course something we're going to get into in a great deal of detail in our next episode, where we're going to be talking about who are these non-automatons who are fighting on the battlefield, who are these living, breathing human beings who came from their little villages, from their farms, to fight with a bunch of strangers, essentially, to be in these huge heaving bodies of men pushing against each other on the battlefield, exposing themselves to javelins and darts and arrows and spears and swords, and to being trampled by elephants and all that. What really brought them there? What kept them there? How did they see their place in the world? How did they fight? How did they die? So if you like this episode, you will absolutely love our next episode, which is Inside the World of the South Indian Warrior. And we are going to be taking you on a journey with these warriors, not just within the South Indian peninsula itself, but also in South India's infamous invasions of Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. And we're going to be talking more about the military culture of this fascinating time. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in our next episode.
Thank you.
If you like this show, tell your friends about us and tell us what else you'd like to learn about India's violent, complicated history. Hit us up on Twitter or Instagram. Just search for our names. I'm Anirudh Kanisetti, that's Kanisetti.
And I'm Aditya Ramanathan, that's Aditya-Ramanathan.
And tell us what you think of Yuddha. Tell us what you'd like to hear. And most importantly, don't forget to check out other interesting shows on the IVM network. And while you're at it, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at IVM Podcasts.
I hope you enjoyed that show. We'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week. Thank you, HDFC Life, for coming on board. Also, would like to thank Storytel for continuing the long time advertising that they've been doing with us. And if you have a brand and you'd like to advertise with us, please send us an email. We'd love to talk to you. And let me tell you a couple of things that you should check out this week. On States of Anarchy, Humsini talks about the Brazil-India relationship. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ayushi and Ritasha talk about pleasure, sex, and much more. On a nostalgia-laden episode of the Geek Fruit podcast, Tejas and Dinkar go back to the franchise with the Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies and talk about how they hold up today, 12 years after the last movie came out. On our Kannada podcast, Thalle Arate, scholar Avinash Amble combines neuroscience, mathematical logic, and the cutting edge of computer science to explain the history of machine vision to Pawan and Surya. On Tapri Tales, Madhuri weaves the tale around a conversation between three friends. Thanks and keep listening.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday
On the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!